let us know if there are any issues with hearing as well. I've had this Susan Cain quote sitting up here for a little bit now. It's interesting because, you know, she talks about natural powers of introverts: persistence, concentration, insight, and there are a lot more of them really than that. But the cool thing is that it really is a case of us understanding what our powers are, in a sense, and making sure that we are in situations or environments or workplaces where we can use those to their fullest potential, and so that we can actually develop in these different areas as well. Now, again, there's the bio. Karen has covered that well already. In terms of an overview of what we're going to do, we're going to talk briefly about introverted strengths, and I'm going to share a few of those, but I'd like you all to share what you all see as introverted strengths as well, because it's a lot more than just what I'll share in here and also what I think. We'll also talk about ways of identifying those strengths, and we will focus specifically on one type of inventory that you can take and identify things, but there are many other ones out there. We're also going to talk about what it means to actually harness those strengths once you've identified them, and then I want us to talk a little bit about how we'll start our leadership journeys. No matter where we are on it, there are places for us to go, people to see, all of that good stuff, but none of us have really arrived, regardless of how well we may appear to have arrived on the outside. So let's talk about introvert strengths a little bit. I have a few things listed here. The idea of strong listening and analytical skills, the ability to dive deeply into a topic, being able to participate in a team without seeking a lot of recognition. But this is just kind of scratching the surface, and these may or may not all be exactly applicable to us in the same way, but I'd like to hear from our attendees. What do you see as introvert strengths? Those of you who are introverts and those of you who are extroverts, what do you see as introvert strengths? I'm really hoping for participation here.
Asking for participation from introverts.
They can hear you.
I know. That's okay.
Ben, this is Karen. I think that subject matter expertise and sometimes empathy are strengths.
Okay. Subject matter expertise gets into the diving deeply part. How do you see the empathy? See, now I'm going to ask you questions and no one's going to participate. So how do you see empathy as playing a role in introvert strengths?
Well, I think, you know, as an introvert myself, I often, you know, am uncomfortable being the center of attention, and I can understand how others in similar situations or who are even more introverted than myself would feel that way, and I can understand why it's sometimes difficult to get them to participate or to lead, both, you know, at work or in professional organizations.
So as an introvert, you're able to recognize really other introverts in your organization and probably have a better understanding of how they can be successful. It's interesting. Kirk St. Amant and I were chatting in the podcast. I'll provide that link later, but the next podcast episode has to do with introverts in the classroom. And we were talking, both of us are introverted instructors, and we're very much aware of what it's like to sit in a classroom as an introvert and try to provide opportunities for people to participate that they're comfortable with, but also very cognizant of the fact that if we split students into groups, extroverts tend to dominate because introverts are used to thinking through things and processing internally and not externally. How about some of the other people on the call? I can't see who's in these large rooms, But have you all seen as introvert strengths?
They get the work done.
Okay. So other ideas, other introvert strengths?
Deirdre said the ability to see beyond people's titles.
That's interesting. Oh, and I wish you could participate verbally on this. In what ways do we see beyond people's titles? All right, I'm asking a verbal question on a chat, so I don't know how this is going to work. Or does anybody else have ideas on how that might work?
I'm hearing a lot of synonyms and different polite ways of saying intelligence.
Okay, so we'll say introverts are smarter than extroverts, and hope nobody ever hears this recording.
That's what I'm hearing.
So other ideas of introvert strengths. Those of you who are introverts, what do you see as your strengths? You all have them, and a lot of the times the challenge is actually identifying them. So, okay, so Deirdre says we are more likely to challenge things we don't agree with, and we value autonomy more than extroverts. So I can peg Deirdre as being very similar to me, which may or may not stand true for all introverts, but is definitely, there's a layer of that with me. Any other idea? We won't stay here the whole time, I promise that, but any other ideas on introvert strengths?
As an introvert, if I'm in a group that's brainstorming or if I'm leading a training session, I actively seek out opinions from other introverts, so they don't get left behind, so to speak.
Cool, and that falls into the empathy thing that Karen was talking about at the beginning too. So that's very cool. So I won't belabor this. I'm in classroom mode because I'm teaching a class Tuesday, Thursdays, and I'm used to just making students participate.
I have an additional comment.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, I think introverts see things as they are, whereas extroverts tend to want to guide things and may not see what's actually sitting in front of them, because they're if you're talking, then you're not at the same time, as a rule, taking in things in your senses. So introverts have the capacity to perceive.
And I think that gets down to what we might call active listening also. And the conversation with Kirk, he put it as listening to listen, compared to listening and really thinking more about what you're going to be saying than what the person, what you're going to be saying next and what the person is saying. So it's interesting how these things work. Let's go ahead and go a little bit deeper with this. Part of the challenge is identifying what our strengths are. And as an introvert, me especially, I am very cognizant of my weaknesses and all of the things that I should know more about, all the things that I should do better. But I think one of our challenges is that we need to be able to look at the things. Well, there are a couple of things. One, we may actually flip what we may regard as weaknesses actually may be strengths. So I think that's one aspect of this. But the other thing is understanding that, yes, we do bring strengths, whether, as I talked about Wednesday, whether it was an influencer or a leader, but the idea is that you do bring strengths, and the idea is to, how do we find out what those are? Now, some of you on the call were part of a workshop that I did, I think for the first time, which I didn't tell you at that point, a couple of years ago at the Conduit Conference in Willow Grove. And we worked through some of these things, primarily relying on what they call Keirsey temperament sorter, or Keirsey temperament theory. But there are a lot of different tools that you can use to find out more about yourself. And for me, part of what I found is just having that self-knowledge gained from whether it's doing inventories, chatting with other people, doing more reading and figuring out what really resonates with you. Having that information makes it really much easier for me in the workplace or in life in general, I think, to understand what my preferences are and where I can succeed and what I need to be able to do to succeed. So we're not going to go through all of the elements on here, and at one point I'd really love to dig into the Enneagram because it's a little more interesting and complicated than some of these other ones a little bit. But we're going to pretty much stick with the Keirsey temperament sorter today. Now, I had asked, I didn't ask, but I put a slide up and gave you all of 5 minutes to probably do it. How many of you all have taken a Myers-Briggs or other type of temperament inventory or strengths finder or something like that?
Have you done it?
I have.
Everybody in this room has.
So
I have.
what did you come back as? I mean, what were your results? Yes, did you pass? When that's not
Some of our eyes don't want to share.
INTP.
Okay.
Myers-Briggs Flash.
Deirdre's an
I'm an ESFJ, but you know that.
I think I was INTJ.
Deirdre, I could have told you that by the first thing you posted in the chat. So we had a couple of people talking over each other because it's next to impossible to do this way. I heard INTP, I heard INTJ. I don't know if I got the other ones.
ESFJ. But J is only 1%.
Okay, but the E is there. So anyone else want to share? Nobody. I do not typically force people to share. It kind of goes against everything. So
I'm an ISFJ.
okay. And I don't remember exactly what that one stands for, but we'll get to it in a minute. So what I've found, digging into this, I've learned more about myself. And as I tell people, some of it's a little embarrassing because I had to read where it said I could be a good leader as an INTJ before I was really willing to think I could be any kind of leader whatsoever. So for some of us, we are very dependent on what these writings give us and the information they give us. But part of it is just learning that as a leader or as an influencer, it's not all what the Western world portrays as a successful leader. We're not necessarily loud in front of people, charismatic, very directive types of people. And I think it's important that we learn that although we may not have these strengths or may not be dominant in situations, that doesn't mean that we're weaker or that we're handicapped in any type of way at all. So looking a little bit at the whole spectrum here is the ESTJ through INFP is what we have on the thing on the left. But the idea in general is that extroverts, for the most part, gain energy from the external world of people, objects, and events. Now, you can see on the slide, it talks about introverts gaining energy from internal world of thoughts, ideas, and emotions. That's very true. What the slide doesn't tell us is that for extroverts not being around an external world of people, objects, external stimuli, they lose energy when they're not around that. Now, for me as an introvert, if I am continually around people, I can manage a conference, I can get through 4 or 5 days of it. But if I'm continually around people, I lose energy. And by that time, that large period of being on with people is over, I'm exhausted usually.
I'm the same way.
Really often, I don't really want to go out and do much of anything. Now, it's interesting being married to an extrovert because Marilyn really likes how on I am at conferences, but I'm not that way at home. So we have interesting conversations about that. Other differences, this sensation part, trusting facts and focusing on details, compared to intuition, where you trust insight and focus on the big picture. Probably 70% of the population are sensate, are sensing people, and not intuitive. So the large majority of our population really focuses on the things they can see, the things they can handle, the detail things. They don't necessarily think in the abstract about things that could be. So it makes it really interesting to keep that in mind when you're having conversations with people. One of the things that's interesting is if I get in a conversation with another or another intuitive person and we hit it off, we can talk for hours. If I'm talking with someone who is more of an S and I'm an N for intuition, that conversation doesn't often last as long because I think we get bored with each other because we're so interested in talking about different types of things and even think about different things. Other differences, this idea of thinking versus feeling, and you can read it, it's more the Spock view in some ways on the thinking and the empath on the, or Counselor Troy, for those of you who remember back that far, on the feeling side. And then we've got the judgment and perception, and judgment is basically making decisions and moving forward or in whatever direction. Perception is really kind of trying to put off having to make a decision until you've got all the facts in. And it brings a lot of, it can bring a lot of tension into the workplace or into teams, but it can also bring a lot of strength because you get people approaching things from different aspects. Now, one thing that's interesting, and my apologies, some of you have seen some of these slides before, there have been all sorts of popular kind of personality systems. I mean, even if you look at horoscopes and things like that, and the idea of a horoscope, you've got everybody divided into 12 different signs, you know, and those are pretty much equal numbers. And I think even going back to some of the ideas the ancient Greeks had about different types of personalities and temperaments, you still had the sense that things were pretty equally divided. When you do these kind of inventories, you find out that they aren't very equally divided at all. And for instance, I'm an INTJ, Deirdre's an INTJ. We're a small percentage of the population. INFJs are even smaller. And what that means is that what we consider to be normal in terms of how we think about things and maybe not putting a lot of respect into authority in general is not what the rest of the population thinks. Now, one of the hallmarks of being an INTJ is being convinced that we're right almost 90% of the time. So it's something we have to, and 90% probably is much higher. But we also have to keep that in mind, that there is no correct or better temperament type than that. But it's interesting looking at the different population distribution, and those of you who have taken this kind of inventory can kind of see where you fit and how many of you are in different areas. But like I said, actually for sensing, it's got that at 73% of the population overall, so that's even higher than I had said. The rest of them are kind of much more equal, though thinking is, feeling, well, that's interesting, feeling is stronger, much more prevalent than thinking. And I won't make any comments about that because I don't need to now. So when you look, the way Kiersey handles this, when you take a Myers-Briggs type test online, and all of them have a little bit different flavor. Every different school of thought uses the letters a little bit differently, and it gets a little confusing because you think you're reading the same language, but it doesn't mean the same thing in different areas. But the idea with the Kiersey, it divides into 4 main types, this idea of artisan, guardian, rational, and idealist. Now, one thing that has been interesting is over the years in terms of artisans, I don't usually have artisans who are interested in this subject at all. And it's been rare that I've ever had one sit in on a workshop or anything like that at all. The other 3 temperament types seem to be fairly well represented. But you'll notice that you've got an artisan, and the idea is that these are people who just kind of want to get things done, and they don't really care about, well, may not care about feelings, and I'll probably be a little too strong on this. They don't care about feelings, don't necessarily care about following the rules. But then you've got the largest part of your population is really guardians, and I'll throw another slide up in a minute for that. And those are a subset of the population for whom rules and authority are very important. So you can see the opportunities for conflict between artisans and guardians right there, where you have people who really care about authority, care about tradition, and then you have another group which doesn't care, seem to care about them at all and doesn't factor into their thinking. And then you can see they've got it divided into rationals, which are more logic-based, and idealists, which are more feeling-based. But it's interesting because one of the things to keep it, and I'm not going to try to go into the bottom part, but you will have the slides. One of the things to keep in mind is, again, the population, the occurrence of these behaviors and of these groups in the population is not even. And much as I would like to claim this is a pyramid and the right people are on top, it's not really showing us that. It's just kind of showing the increase in the percentage of population among these different groups. But what that means is coming in as a rational, Deirdre, for instance, we don't think like most other people. And that's something that we have to remember as we're working with other people. We are not always right, hard as it is for us to admit, we are not always right. And most people don't appreciate people who think they're always right anyway. But besides that, you've got these different groups. You need to think about the fact that people are not all the same temperament type. And we kind of know it, but we also tend to think that people think like we do. And that is definitely not the case. So that's kind of an overview of where we go into the different temperament types. I'm going to talk a little bit more about actually harnessing this. I mean, once we know these things, what does that mean for us? Many of you have taken different inventories. You came back with different sets of letters. What I don't have a good feel for yet is, what difference did that make for you? Did it make any difference, or was it just kind of like, well, that's nice to know that, but it doesn't change anything about how I approach things? And one interesting quote, there's nothing we cannot do if we harness the power within us. Now, I'm going to subvert that a little bit and basically say that once we understand what our introvert powers, talents, strengths are, there's a lot we can accomplish. Now, maybe we can't do everything, but what we are able to do is harness things that are reflective of us instead of looking them as barriers or impediments or weaknesses. And I think that part's really, really important. Yes, as introverts, we tend to be quiet. We tend to not answer quickly on things, but we also tend to give things a lot of thought before we provide answers. And understanding that while culture and maybe extroverts don't really quite get that because they're looking for the quick, ready answer, we know that we can come up with better answers as we've had time to really think things through. And again, we often may communicate better in writing. So we're going to go look a little bit deeper into this. So as I mentioned, Kiersey divides things into 4 different areas. So we've got guardians we'll start with, and you can see the likes, and we've referenced this already. We respect authority. We defer to the boss. Results and details matter. Organization's more important than the individual. So we know those things are things that they like. Now, we had at least one SJ on here. Any ideas what guardians would not like?
Loose cannons.
Okay, and what is a loose cannon?
Someone who just kind of wings it and does their own thing and doesn't really pay attention to process or convention.
Okay, so that's one thing for sure. Other ideas? And Deirdre, feel, please type in if you want to. I'm watching for your responses as well.
As am I.
Boredom.
Is that referencing the presentation or Guardians? Yeah.
That's the guardians that don't like what you don't, what I as an SJ don't like.
They don't like change.
Oh,
Okay,
I
they
love,
don't like change.
That's
But
true.
Laura, you're saying you don't like boredom, so you don't like things to be routine.
not too. You gotta, jumble it up every so often.
So I'm not sure. Yeah, I think there are Guardians who would be quite happy if things never jumbled up. But that's why even splitting things into these different groups, it's too broad a characterization. So
I'm always an SJ.
this is wrong. This is not in here. The interdependent view is wrong. That shouldn't be in here. What they don't like is the independent view. That's mistyped. Rocking the boat, potential or unnecessary. They don't like chaos for the most part. Now,
Right.
you may want some change, but you don't want chaos. Rocking the boat, I think that's a bit of that loose cannon. Yeah, we're mixing metaphors like crazy, but I think that's that loose cannon thing a little bit too. So don't remember how, I know we had one Guardian. I suspect we had more than that, and I'm trying to remember looking back at some of you, but don't have all that in front of me. So one group. Another group is artisans. Now, do we have any artisans on this call who weren't forced to be here?
Which was the artisans again? Sorry.
So artisans are the ones who typically aren't interested in theoretical stuff.
Well, I came out as an SJ, but it's only 1% on the J side.
Yeah, well, SJ is, you're actually Guardian. You're, so
I
you're
know,
close to an artisan. Okay.
but I'm close.
And this is the second time at least you've sat through some of the stuff. So
Think?
yeah, it's interesting. So artisans in general, they're more interested in results, getting things done. Ends justify the means. For a Guardian or for an idealist, that is like the last thing that you're willing to accept. Ends do not justify the means. Artisans often want to win. Their negotiation styles may be brutal. It's interesting when you start looking at political figures and trying to determine, well, where do they fit? What kind of personality type are they, or what temperament type are they? And I think it's fairly easy and fairly straightforward to do, and I'll let you, fill in the gaps around that. But given that these are the things that artisans like, what do you think that they don't like? What kinds of things?
Ambiguity.
Okay, ambiguity. Yeah, they want things black and white for sure. What else?
Endless discussion.
I couldn't hear that one.
Endless discussion.
Okay, so they want to close things.
Losing.
Losing, yeah, that's good. I don't like losing either, but I'm not an artisan. But that's a flaw on my part as well as a strength. Any other thoughts? What else might they not care about?
They may not care about process.
Okay, they may not care about how things got done.
Right.
They care about they got things done. And the other part is that they frankly don't really care about the people end of it in terms of how does somebody feel when they did the work. I mean, was it important for you to do this? It doesn't matter. They want the ends. They don't care necessarily. And again, I'm generalizing, but they don't necessarily care about what John did or what, I'll use real names, what Jessica did to do on something as to what Lori did or somebody else, because I can see these names in front of me. It makes it easier. So artisans, again, you've got another temperament type. We've got idealists. Now, were any of you idealists, any of you NFs at all?
Yes.
So, Karen, were you, what are you? What are you besides an NF?
I can't remember. It was a long time ago when I took the Myers-Briggs.
So idealists care about people. They invest in people. The story I tell with this, I have a very good friend, Elisa Bonsignor, who's an INFJ, which is a counselor type. And we talk about what would happen if we were on a ship and the thing broke down. I, as an INTJ, would be in the engine room trying to get the engine started. She would be making sure the people got off the ship. So it's a much more people-focused role. It's also much more, obviously, idealistic, believing the best for things, caring about harmony and individual growth. So what would idealists not like?
They don't like selfishness and lack of empathy, bullies, that kind of thing.
Makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that pretty much gives it the bully thing is they don't like artisans. I can tell you that much from hearing that part of it. But again, you've got a belief in the future, a belief in things being positive. So that's 3 out of the 4. The 4th one is rationals, which is, again, they're, Jessica, I think you're an INTJ. I know Deirdre is, can't remember, we're going back 2 years here, but the idea is that we look for competency, we look for excellence. We don't really accept the status quo. We're always looking for better ways to do things. And that may or may not trample on people sometimes, and it may or may not mean breaking social norms, but what it does mean is that we have a good opportunity to be innovative because we look at things differently. This part's interesting because it says we don't like personal anecdotes during presentations. Those have been the hardest things for me to add in to presentations when I do them because I think I'm just not comfortable with them. And it's, as an introvert, it's really hard for us to talk about ourselves anyway because we're kind of putting ourselves out there. It gets a little bit scary. But again, everything is about being pragmatic, using what works, not necessarily what's been done in the past. So we get these 4 different temperament types. And what that means is that all of you are parts of these things. And part of what we try to do with this is try to figure out, well, what are our strengths? So I am a rational, I'm pragmatic. What does that mean in terms of how I approach my job? What does that mean in terms of how I approach life in general? A lot of thoughts around that. So my apologies if any of you were on the call Wednesday, because I went into this a little bit then. I'm going to do it again now as well. But for an INTJ as an example, and we will talk about, I would like to hear from some of you as well on other temperament types. I'm an introvert, I'm intuitive, I'm thinking, I'm judging. Now, again, I'm an introvert. If you see me at a conference or a presentation, you're not going to believe I'm an introvert at all. If you see me hiding somewhere afterwards, you would probably believe I'm an introvert. But the things that for a rational, for a mastermind, which is a temperament descriptor for my type, really good at planning. We're self-confident. We tend to be, it's systemic. We look at how things work and why things work. We're utilitarian. We only really care about using what works. We can be strong-willed and we can be ingenious. So those are all the good things. I didn't really go into the bad parts of it, but I've done that plenty of other times.
Let's be positive.
So we'll keep it positive because we're working on strengths. As you can see, self-confident can obviously mean overconfident. So somebody is bleeding through.
Can everyone mute themselves unless you're making a comment, please?
Yeah, it's Lori. We can blame Lori.
I can't mute because I have people remotely in.
Ah.
Okay.
How did we have that muted before? That's so weird.
I can try muting everyone. Or I can mute her. Okay, there we go. Let's see if that helps.
Good. I couldn't do that. So anyway, sorry about that. So going back to the foundations piece of this INTJ thing, I mean, we talked about this preference of extroverts, introverts, sensing, intuitive, and so forth. For an INTJ, I gave me energy from the internal world of thoughts, ideas, and emotions. I'm just like probably almost all of you on this call who are introverts. This is where we gain energy. This is where we spend our time. We are not just sitting there blankly, usually. At a meeting or at an event, we're thinking through a lot of things and we just don't process them externally. Extroverts process externally. There's usually no question what an extrovert is thinking or feeling about something because they're usually talking about it. We tend to be much more guarded in terms of revealing our thoughts, our emotions around things. Again, for me as an INTJ, I trust insight and focus on the big picture. And I actually trust insight more than I trust data. And I think part of that, and there's a danger in that, obviously, but part of that is because I'm focused on what could be if we look at things differently and not feeling like, and sometimes feeling like data can bind us into doing things in certain ways and not allow us an opportunity to explore things we might not explore. Now, granted, that also means that I might lead into risks which were not founded in what data was showing. And it's, again, something to keep in balance. Again, I tend to be much more thinking than feeling. I've referenced that already. And I am more a J than I am a P. Though I will slip into a P occasionally when I take these inventories, depending on how I've been spending the majority of my time. But for me, most of the time, I want to make a decision of some kind and move things forward. So I've got a bunch of other slides which kind of reference basic things about what it means to be planning and self-confident. I am not going to read through these things. Systemic, utilitarian, willful, and ingenious. But what I want to do is really have conversation at this point in time. I want us to think, we've talked about these temperament types, we've talked about what some of the strengths are. We've not gone into great depth because we obviously can't do it in this period of time. But I'm interested in what this means for you, how you apply this. Do you have methods that you use now? Are there steps that you've taken to identify your strengths and your abilities? Are there steps that you're going to take? How do you identify opportunities to stretch yourself and to grow? One of the harder things to do as an introvert, I think, is to be willing to stretch ourselves. But everyone I've talked to, that's how we grow. We don't grow by not being willing to be stretched. So I want to just kind of open this to conversation for most of what we've got, the time we have left. And I've asked about temperament types. What I want to get some idea from you, though, is, are you doing things to identify your strengths and abilities? How are you finding out more about them? What does that mean for you in your workplace? And this is, it's a little bit deeper conversation than maybe you had planned on, but I'm not going to apologize for it because that's part of the stretching and that's part of how we grow. I will throw one more quote up from Susan Cain at this point, which I thought was pertinent to what we're talking about today. Because the key thing here really is you want to do things in ways that are true to you, and don't force yourself to be something you are not. We do want to stretch, we do want to grow, but we also have to recognize that we have certain things that we function best in, and that gives us a lot of power to accomplish things. So let's open this conversation. We've talked about the strengths and abilities. What are you all doing in terms of how are you actualizing this? We've talked about a lot of things, but we're going to make it personal, which is scary as all get out. But in some ways, how are you actualizing this? What are you doing with opportunities? Do you see opportunities to stretch yourself? And are you willing to share some of that, which is the bigger question?
This is Karen. I really force myself to, and I really have to force myself to participate in networking and to take on, sometimes additional leadership responsibilities, just because, I don't know if it's a lack of confidence or just the fact that, I don't like being the one who's the center of attention often. So, that's really what I just have to force myself to do these things. But I find these personality inventories to be helpful when dealing with people at work, because if we do them as part of team building exercises, and you can learn what's important to the people that you work with, then you can learn how to better present information to them, so that you can get what you want, or build a relationship, or whatever it is you're trying to do. So there's kind of two ways. It's what can you do for yourself, but also how do you interact with the people that you're working with also.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I would have described myself as a reluctant leader. Definitely before I started doing anything. I'm much more used to it now. And I am much more, if I feel like I can make a difference, I tend to run towards it. But initially I was very reluctant. How about, let's hear from some of our other attendees.
Deidre here has a comment. Let me see what she says here. She recently made herself volunteer for a process working group, and she will try to keep an open mind and hope that we can help reduce some unnecessary process overhead for our project managers.
Sounds good.
Okay, very cool. So thoughts from the rest of you about things you're either doing or things you might consider doing from discussing this stuff today?
The people in this room may speak. We're green again.
Yes.
They're very quiet. I'm the only E here,
And they're deferring to you.
Jess, how about your group?
Anyone here? Well, I can say one thing I was thinking about, since introverts tend to need a little bit more time to process information, giving everybody a chance to, if you want a decision or talk about an item, it's probably could be a good idea to give everybody a heads up on what you're going to talk about, instead of just springing it on them in a meeting and saying, let's talk about this, and not really having a lot of time to process it ahead of time.
That's interesting. That's good.
Yeah, it's a really good point. One of the, and I'm going to go ahead and move the slides along a little bit here, just because I want to have the podcast sitting up there. One of the discussions that's come up over and over since I started doing the podcast back in August is this issue of meetings and what it's like for introverts in meetings, and the expectation that we be able, and I've done it to you all here today on the presentation too, but this idea of all of a sudden having to come up with answers around things and not have time to reflect and time to think through it. So that's a very common challenge for us as introverts, because we're not processing out loud. And what happens typically is that the extroverts dominate the conversation in the meeting because they are processing out loud, and they come up with ideas, and people tend to jump on the ideas because they're the first ideas, but that doesn't mean they're the best ideas. So interesting ideas around, what to do with that. The one thing that I had a workshop attendee mention is that his manager had spoken to him because of his meeting behavior not being what it should be, because he wasn't participating enough. And, you know, kind of the classic, well, I'm an introvert thing, but looked at as being something negative. And he met with his manager, and whenever it was possible, she agreed to provide him an agenda of the meeting beforehand so that he had a better idea of what they were going to be discussing. And that gave him time to start thinking about things. So that's like, I think, a pretty good technique to use with an introverted team, especially to kind of, in a sense, equalize the playing field.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So anyone else have any thoughts around what we've been talking about today? And don't feel like you have to. I just want to try to make this more conversational and less me talking. So I encourage you, if I'm not already connected with you, you know, please reach out to me, connect with me on LinkedIn, drop me an email if you'd like to chat more, or if you've got observations about what we've talked about today. I would also encourage you, and there are many of you in this group who are already part of this, we do have an Introverted Leadership Slack community that we've been running for a little over 2 years now. We have about 200 introverts signed up for this, and we still have very small discussions because it's the way these things work, but it's an opportunity to expand the discussions around topics we've talked about today, but also in terms of what does it mean to be an introvert and be a manager? You know, what are the best ways to handle things, you know, in the workplace? Do people have suggestions around things? How do I become a presenter? I mean, that can be a frightening thing both for introverts and extroverts. But those are the kinds of things that we're happy to chat about. So does anyone have any final thoughts? It sounds so dire. Anyone else have anything they'd like to chat about or ask about?
Everyone's unmuted, so feel free to speak up. Oh, Deidre has a comment. Learning about my type helped explain how I make some decisions, very intuitive, and how sometimes I need more time to process technical info that's outside my wheelhouse, especially being presented verbally.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would personally much rather read through materials than have someone try to explain them to me.
Oh, me too. I'm a visual person. I need to see it either on paper or pictures or words or something. Anyone else?
We have got it.
It looks like we've tapped everyone out at this point. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate you signing up and attending this today. I love being able to talk about this stuff. It's always good. And you know, please connect with me if you're not already. And I appreciate those of you who have heard me previously actually showing up. I always find that a wonder. But thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Ben, for presenting this information to us. I find it very useful, and I'm sure that everyone else has as well. We've recorded this session, although I have to apologize. I forgot to hit the record button in the very beginning. So if you listen to it again, you'll miss my introduction of Ben and his first few words, but the majority of the presentation was recorded. The slides will be up on SlideShare in the next day or so, I think. And thank you very much. Deidre also says, thank you, Ben. This was very informative.
Thanks, Ben.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope so.